Our next discussion pertains to dealing with page layout. This is one item that new designers tend to have a little bit of difficulty with, but you'll see that with a couple additional tag elements, we will be able to fix up a website to have quite a bit of flexibility. As mentioned in the previous lecture, designers decades ago would prefer to use that table tag to control the position of elements on a page, to create columns and sidebars, banners, etc. But that tag, again, is limited. It has that particular item, it does have its limitations. So we're going to be combining div containers along with CSS to allow for a lot more control. So thinking about CSS, it's great for not just formatting text or navigation bars or images, etc., but it also lets you, make much more sophisticated designs. We discussed previously, and I'll pop on back to this document here, that the float property, which is what we used on this image to allow this text to kind of pop around to the side of it, is going to be very helpful with images. But you can also produce multi-column layouts using that property as well. It isn't isolated only to being used with images. It can be used with other block level content also. CSS also has a position property associated with it, which can let you place elements absolutely. So that's like within a specific pixel range, horizontally or vertically within the page. This is referred to as absolute positioning. Now, this does come with its own set of problems, and it isn't frequently used to lay out entire web pages, but I will show you how to work with both layout types. So while we're talking about page layouts, I'm actually going to bounce on over to a web browser. And you might recognize this as one of the student examples that I had sent you previously. So one challenge that web designers often experience is dealing with the unknown. You don't know what kind of browser the visitor of your web page is going to be using necessarily. It might be their phone. It might be a tablet. It might be a small screen like on a laptop, or it might be on a large desktop screen. There are a lot of factors and resolutions that come into play. So there are two types of layouts that we will be exploring: a fixed width layout and a liquid or fluid and flexible layout. A fixed width layout, and this particular website is a good example of that, gives you the most control over your design, but it can be inconvenient. Like if I were to shrink this screen and pretend I have a laptop, once I get to about here, you'll notice that the web page does not play nice with narrower screens, and I have to scroll sideways in order to review the content present. So this is a fixed width layout. The content doesn't fluctuate. You'll notice that the blue narrows, but once I get to this rectangular chunk of information, this div, it doesn't shrink past that size. Or in some instances, if it isn't centered, sometimes content will cling to the left side of the page, which also isn't as attractive as it could be. A liquid layout, on the other hand, and I'll switch to the college's website in this example, kind of rolls with the tide. Content adjusts in size or shape depending upon the size of the browser it's being used on. So you can see how this large banner that cycles through different photographs starts to shrink right there. And you'll notice that these columns of content go from being side by side to being stacked and consolidated further. So this type of design allows for a lot more flexibility, and it's called a liquid layout or a fluid layout because it does have the ability to resize and look pretty good. And you'll notice both of them have centered content. You can see the blue space here and the white space here, but the difference there is that you're able to adjust one and have that content shrink relative to the screen it's being viewed on, whereas the other only shrinks so much before you can't see what's being presented. So as I mentioned before about the float property, this allows you to position elements side by side to create essentially columns of content. I'm going to do that on a new web page here. I'm going to go to Insert, and I'm going to grab my div tag. And it's right here at the very top of the HTML grouping. Div is right here. Just to make sure you can see this all right, I'm going to switch to Design. And it basically places a little box with some text that's telling you where the div tag is going to go. Whatever layout method you end up choosing, whether that is a fixed width or static layout or a liquid or fluid layout, either way, you need to design your page by putting chunks of information into different regions on the page, right? So I'm going to develop sort of a mock web page for you to review. Open up my properties panel and place that down here at the bottom. I will click outside of my div. So you can see my div tag here. I'm going to click outside of that div to add a new div. You'll notice that when I place another div onto the page after one's been created, it's going to give me some options. I clicked outside of this div, so hopefully that's where it's going to insert, but I can also tell it to start after or before specific tags as well to nest them inside of one another. There's my new div. We'll make a sidebar and we'll do one more, and I'll tell it I want this to be my main content. So something to keep in mind is that the div tag is an HTML element, but it has no inherent formatting set to it initially, other than the fact that browsers are going to treat it like a block element with a line break before or after it if you separate those. So at the very least, I'm just breaking my page up into separate chunks or separate sections at this point. So maybe you want to have a sidebar, a footer. Actually, I'll put a footer in as well. One more div. I'll call it my footer. As you create divs, it's not a terrible idea to start naming them. I didn't add classes to any of mine, or IDs for that matter, but if you recognize that you will be needing to make those in order to style that content, it's a good idea to do that ahead of time. But I can go ahead and add those. I do have an existing style sheet, so let me attach that. So you can see it recognized my header right off the bat. I'll go ahead and add in a few additional items. So I'll make my sidebar a class. And while I'm here, just to make sure that you can differentiate them visually, I'm going to make them a slightly different color. Alright, so my sidebar will be pink. Let me apply. I will highlight my div and add that class. So there's my sidebar. I'll call my main content div my main div, and I'll go ahead and give that a color as well, just to differentiate. I will highlight, give it that class. I already have a footer sidebar, or I already have a footer style, so let me add that here. Footer. There we go. So right now I'm just adding additional selectors to these, whether it's a class or an ID, just to make sure that I can manipulate and differentiate that content. While I'm here, I'm also going to get some lorem ipsum from this page just to fill up my main content section. So I'm going to highlight some of that content, and I'm going to come over here and add that here. And for now, I'll delete my picture just to kind of break it up. So each of these divs is essentially wrapping around that content to help contain whatever's inside of it. So think of it as like kind of a box around that content. And I can easily control anything inside of that div by applying it to that selector. So as an example, if I wanted to change what font I'm using, you'll notice that it changed the section up at the top said main content, but it did not change these other paragraphs. The reason behind that is that those paragraphs are being controlled by the p tag right here. So if I wanted to alter how that appears, I would want to maybe disable or delete that property to make that content alter. But it is affecting everything inside of the div and not any of the other content visible elsewhere. So now we want to alter this layout to make the sidebar appear to be a sidebar and to make the main content appear to be a larger chunk of information. So I'm going to click my sidebar. I'll go ahead and pick that selector, and I want to alter that property. Right now, the width of both of these is set to auto. So I want to control the size of my sidebar. Maybe I only want it to be 150 pixels wide. You see how that shrank from stretching across the screen to only fitting a certain size screen. Okay, so far so good. Maybe I want this to be like my navigation. But you'll notice now I'm running into that same sort of gap issue. So in addition to controlling that width, now I want to apply a float. I want that sidebar to stay left. And you'll see now that that div adjusted. Okay, so far so good. But now I've got an issue where maybe I want this pink to extend all the way down. I don't want it to stop and then have like an awkward box right there. In this instance, you can see where the width is causing problems. Now I could alter my main content and control the width of that as well. We'll say 600 pixels. You can see that that alters the width, but that doesn't resolve that problem that I'm running into with my nav bar. It did fix the width, but it didn't move from the side that I wanted it to move from. So an area that could help you here is, instead of picking a pixel weight ratio for these two areas, let's pick a percentage, because remember, this is relative. So we'll say 15%. And again, considering that the total width of that screen is 100%, I'm going to subtract this percentage from 100. So 15 out of 100, that leaves me with 85%. Lastly, I'm going to float my content to the right. And you'll notice that now my sidebar stays where the sidebar belongs, and my main content stays where the main content belongs, and they are separated visually. If I wanted to add in an additional sidebar, I would want to place that div after my main content but before my footer. The order does make a difference. Insert div. I'll call this my right sidebar. You'll notice that it does sort of tuck it underneath the navigation, which looks a little awkward, but again, that comes down to the CSS. Placement's a little awkward here. So pick my selector, right sidebar. I want to have this float to the right, and I need to control the percentage as well. So again, between the pink and the blue, that equals 100. So for me to fit this little bit on the other side, I would need to adjust my math. So we'll say the width of this is going to be 15% as well. Okay, but I'd need to adjust my main. So 15 and 15 is 30. 30 out of 100 is 70. And I will adjust that float. All right, so see how if I pick right or left, it's jumping here. That comes down to, again, the main div. Our main div doesn't have any float, so I want to control where that goes. So the sidebar on the left is floated left. Then I've updated the main content to be floated left. Then I updated this sidebar, the one on the right. So oftentimes that float property is what's causing items to perhaps not go where you expect them to be located. So this is kind of referred to as the box model, and float, that property, is fundamental to that box model that a lot of websites use. If we were to take a look at this example, and you can do this on any website, right-click on the web page and click to view the page source. This is going to require a little bit of your knowledge to understand what it is that you're looking at. But if I use Command or Control F to find, I'm just going to look for my divs. So she's got one container wrapping all of the content. So the reason all of this stuff is staying in a nice, neat little box is because she's got all of that content wrapped in a div. And then there's additional divs inside of it. So she's got a div for the header and a div for the nav bar. Header, nav bar. Then she's got a div for the content with the big picture. And then she's got a div for the paragraph. And then she's got additional divs to control each of these as a group. So these are all divs inside of a bigger div, inside of a much bigger div. And that's how she's controlling it. It's just, think of it as Russian nesting dolls. They just kind of group and help contain that content as they go. So by arranging and manipulating these separate boxes, you can get a lot of different visuals that come out looking very clean once it's all said and done. So a few properties in relation to these that you will want to take into consideration. Width and height, right up here at the top. We've already played with width a little bit. You can specify the dimensions of any styled object using these properties. So if you want a paragraph that's only 100 pixels wide, you can set that width property. And in the case of divs, you can set the width of that div. There are many types of units of measurement here. I would recommend only sticking to percentages or pixels. Otherwise, things get strange. Some of these I'm not even sure what they do, but percentages and pixels are what we're going to be using and what I recommend that you keep an eye on. Something I will say, be careful with the height property. It's really, really tricky to control, especially if a visitor increases the size of the browser, sort of like what I did where I was shrinking and expanding the size of my browser to show you fluid versus static layouts. So I would leave that alone. We talked about the float property, and if you floated a div to the left or right side of the page to make a sidebar, you'll want to make sure that you float additional content around that as well. If you float multiple elements, they can often end up sitting beside each other, sort of like what we did here. But controlling where the float is located is what's going to help control and ensure that the layout flows the way that you'd like it to. The clear property, we talked about float right here. It's right beneath the margin padding and position. The clear property is just as important as that float property. See how my footer, instead of being at the bottom of the page down here where you'd expect it to be, he's kind of tucked up underneath. Clear prevents an element from wrapping around an object with a float. So right now I haven't told my footer, and I'll go find it here. I've told my footer how I want the text to align and how big I want it to be and what color it is, but I have not told it whether it needs to float or not float. So the clear property ensures that it does not float left, right, or both. So I'll click both. You'll notice that the footer has disappeared. And now the footer is where it's located. So basically, clear prevents or forces an item from floating. I'll click on this div next. Padding. Padding is the gap that separates the content of a page, like a paragraph or text or image, from its border. So when I click here, you can see that there's a blue line along the outside of my div. Adjusting the padding is going to ensure that there is some space between the text and the next div, or between the text and the border around the div, for example. So if I'll go ahead and select the area I'm editing, I'll click on main here, and I'll adjust the padding. So in this layout, you see this kind of link here. I can control each side separate, or I can click the link and control them all at the same time. So 5 pixels, it plugs it into all sides, and watch what happens here. So you can see that it puts a nice little chunk of space around the edges. I do know that my sidebar disappeared. I'll explain why momentarily. Margin is the amount of space surrounding the element. So again, see these little thin lines here? Those thin lines represent the padding. Margin is any space outside of the border. So if I wanted a white gap between the main content and the left sidebar, I would add margin here. You can see now I've got a little bit of gap here. It also bumped it down a touch. If I want this block and this block to be flush and not have that little gap, I would want to unlink and tell the top margin I don't want anything. And that brings that back up. So something to keep in mind, you'll notice how my sidebar kind of dipped down lower than I meant for it to. Margins and padding are invisible, but they also have similar effects. So 5 pixels to one side of the padding or margin is adding that additional 5 pixels of space to that style. So even though this plus this plus this equals 100%, because I've made those changes to my main, 70% is now too much because it's got to factor in the margin and padding also. So that adds to that percentage. So let's try maybe 69%. Not quite enough. We'll do 67%. Okay, so that helped alleviate some of that problem that we were running into. So keep in mind, if you run into problems floating your content, 9 times out of 10, that is an issue with the margin or the padding. So if you need that margin or padding to give space to content to ensure that it doesn't feel crowded, you will need to also adjust your widths to make sure that your floats react the way that you expect it to. An area to keep an eye on if you're realizing that perhaps, divs are a bit much. There's a section right here. Header, navigation, main, aside, article, section. These are all essentially functioning as divs also. So if I hypothetically were to come between my header and my content and just throw in navigation, I'll click OK. It puts in a nav tag for navigation, but it does not automatically plug in buttons on your behalf. So these are just additional tags, but they all function just like a div tag. In my lectures, I will be referring to any of these as a div tag. They function the same way, so you will want to treat them the same way. If you want to only ever use the div tag and just go from there, that's also fine, because in the end, they're essentially all functioning the same. These will play a little bit more of a role when we get into dealing with, say, Bootstrap or some other responsive designs later on in the term. But at this point, using these is not going to in any way affect the way that your content appears in this instance. It's going to act like a regular div. Now, while we're here, we're going to talk about absolute positioning. This is also content that functions like a div. I'll call it my AP div. And by default, it's not going to look much different than any of the other divs that you've placed in. But it's called absolute positioning because it lets you specify the exact position of an element. So before you start thinking that you found like page layout heaven, keep in mind that the web is a fluid environment. It's very difficult to control with pixel level precision because you've got no idea what kind of device your viewers are going to be looking at the website through. So it's almost impossible to force content into a specific location without absolute positioning of some kind. So floats and clears take a lot of that work off, but if you need something to maybe kind of float over something, this can be, to produce additional layering. This can be a really good example of that. So I'll come over to my CSS designer. I'm going to make a new selector since I have it selected. it's going to go ahead and just grab that for me. And of all the different layout content, positioning is not on this list. So in order to get to it, you will actually have to come down to more and type in position. And it gives you a few different options here. Just to make this easier to see, I'm going to remove the content and add a photo, because I think that will be easier to see that it's present. Okay, so that's going to be the content of my AP div. I'll come back to my CSS designer. I'll go ahead and type position. There we go. So absolute position, what this means, there we go. So you see how once I clicked on it, it's essentially floating on top of content, and I can move it wherever I want. If I click, you see this little blue square up here. By grabbing that, I can relocate this to wherever I like on my web page, and you can see that it's controlling, okay, it's 233 pixels from the top of my screen and 307 pixels from the left of my screen. So this is the most common object. I can place this tag, this div tag, anywhere on a page, regardless of how it shows up in my HTML. So in other words, the HTML code controlling this div can go anywhere inside of your body tag. So remember, your body tag is up here. It can go anywhere inside of that body tag and still appear anywhere on the page. So the location of its code has no bearing on its on-screen location. That comes from that position property that we've added to it. Now, something to keep in mind, browsers don't always put absolutely positioned elements in relation to the page itself. So if you create a style to position an element inside of another element that's either positioned relatively or absolutely, sometimes the browser positions of the first element affect it. I'll try to make that a little less confusing. The next property under positioning is relative. I'll click on relative here. This option lets you position a tag relative to its position within the HTML. So it is paying attention to where it is in relation to other stuff. Although it has the same top and left position values, as the browser now positions this item relative to where it sits in the HTML. There we go. Now it's updating. So it is paying attention to that now. You can see it's starting to get kind of messy. The static option is going to make it react just like regular old-fashioned HTML, like we've not changed the position at all. This just means it's going to follow that top-down flow of HTML so it appears as it did before I started changing the positioning. Not a big reason to use that, but it's there. And then fixed. Fixed positioning is similar to the fixed value of the CSS attachment property, so that means that the content will be able to scroll and the object will stay in the same spot, typically. Of all of the different positioning elements that you might use, absolute is probably the easiest one to understand, but the textbook does give a really nice visual on page 485 of how these might differentiate from one another. There's an additional property called z-index. You'll notice that that's one of the few z items as a property. This relates to three-dimensional content. So if you think of X being the horizontal and Y being the vertical, the Z index comes forwards and backwards. So this can allow you to take an absolutely positioned div. I'll go ahead and change this back to absolute here. This can allow for you to apply this and float it behind or on top of other divs to give sort of a three-dimensional effect. The Z index of an absolutely positioned div doesn't let you make your web page appear three-dimensional, but it just lets you specify the front to backness or the overlapping of the absolute positioned elements. Honestly, in the way that we're going to be using this, if you want something behind other content, I would just suggest maybe making it a background image as opposed to a div, but you can use the Z index to affect that. Another option is overflow. Suppose you want to make a div that's a specific size and then fill it with a graphic that's bigger. So as an example, I'll grab my absolute position div and I'm going to make that div bigger. So you can see that the width and the height, I've affected the size of that div. Or I can shrink it and now you can see that my picture is larger than the size of the div that I've specified. So the way that the overflow option specifically works, I'll make that a little larger, there we go, is how that div reacts to the content or vice versa. The visible option displays the content that doesn't fit inside the element. So even if that div is tiny, it's still going to display the content inside of it. Hidden chops off or hides the excess content. So even though that photo is about 300 by 300 pixels, give or take, it's only going to display a little piece of it, almost like it's peeking through a window. The scroll option is going to add scroll bars to this in a browser so that visitors can scroll down to see all of the page's content. Let's see if we can get the browser to agree. Not sure why it's not previewing at the moment, but this would add scroll bars to the top or the bottom to allow the viewer to scroll sideways. You may have experienced something like this in your browsing history previously when using the web. And then the auto option is similar to scroll, but it only adds scroll bars if it's necessary to accommodate oversized content. So if it's needed, it'll use them. If it's not, it will not. So pretty much the easiest way for you to know whether or not you're dealing with an absolute position content or object, it's a div tag. Remember, it's just the same as the others. The only difference is that we have given it the absolute position in the style. There's not another way in the software to make this accidentally. So you would have to do it using this particular style. If you need to move it, you want to grab that selection handle. Again, the little blue box up here is going to relocate the whole item. But the outline gives you that thin border. This is going to affect the size of the div, not the location of the div. The only way to move it is to grab it here or to type in a number in relation to its position here. If you look in the Properties panel, you'll notice you've got your width and your height, your left and your top, again referring to the position. There's your Z index right there. Visibility. Overflow is listed down here as well if you don't want to type it into more or you can't recall. Left, top, right, bottom is for clip. So if I type in a number, it's just going to show you how that's going to adjust that. And these are in pixels, so 5 is pixels. 50 would clip it a little bit more, just to hide a portion of it. In order to have that pop up, though, in the Properties panel, you need to click on the little box. Otherwise, it's just going to treat it like a regular div. If you click on the image of the bacon, it's going to pull up content for images. Absolute position content is tricky to get the hang of, but I don't anticipate you needing to use it too much unless you want like a drop-down menu. And in that case, it can be useful, but we'll go into that in a little bit more detail once we get further along into the term.